You're on.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Hi, everybody. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program here at Columbia University. This is our first event of the academic year and, of course, of the fall semester as well. As is my custom, I wanted to start by thanking Daniel Sahensky, who really keeps the program running. We have a very good agenda for the fall. And today is a great example of what we have in store for you. We have a very special guest in Joel Wuthnow from the National Defense University. He's a senior fellow there at the Center for China's Military Affairs. He's an expert on Chinese foreign policy and Chinese security policy. His greatest CV item for us, from our opinion, is, because we're very proud of Joel, is that he was a fellow in our program, in our postdoctoral program from 2011 to 2012 at China and the World. And he did what our fellows do, and he published his PhD dissertation, which he got at Columbia University at a leading press. And his first book was China and the UN Security Council. And Joel, among other things, including being a great military analyst, is one of the leading experts in the world on China's interactions with the United Nations. He has published an edition in several refereed journals, so he's a leading academic on China's foreign relations. He has an AB from Princeton University, MPhil from Oxford, and his PhD, again, right here at Columbia in political science. He's written on military reform in China in the Xi Jinping era, and he's written very good work on the People's Armed Police, which is the sort of paramilitary domestic security organization that was peeled off of the PLA. And we're just really pleased to have him back, because for him it's a homecoming to be back at China and the World. A very active alum of our program. And I think you'll benefit greatly from his talk today, which is a very hot topic, which is China's military strategy towards Taiwan. You'll see a lot of writings, a lot of opinion about it, and a lot of opinions, some of it critical, about traditional U.S. policy towards cross-strait relations and the need to change it or not change it. And Joel is a very authoritative figure to start off our year talking about such an authoritative topic. So welcome, Joel, and we look forward to your talk.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Tom. Thank you, Daniel. Thanks to the China and the World program for making this possible, and delighted to see a lot of old friends and some new ones here in the attendee box as well. So let me kind of jump right into it. So China's strategy towards Taiwan has become a very hot topic in the news. So the question that I'm kind of getting at in this talk here is, will China use force? This is what people have been debating these days. And there are a few different reasons why this has become such a hot topic. First of all, the tempo and the frequency of Chinese military operations around Taiwan has been increasing over the last 5 years. And one of the examples of this are frequent Air Force flights into the Taiwan Strait and into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. The graph here from Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense shows the latest large-scale incursion into Taiwan's southwestern ADAs. And so folks are asking, what does this mean? Certainly the military balance across the Taiwan Strait continues to shift inexorably in favor of mainland China. And the data from the latest Office of the Secretary of Defense China Military Power Report indicates that the PLA has taken a pretty decisive numerical advantage in most of the key weapon systems and areas. And they've also improved themselves quite dramatically in terms of qualitative modernization of their systems. And in addition to that, there has been heated and sometimes hostile rhetoric from senior CCP officials, including Xi Jinping on his January 1st, 2019 address to the people. He stated that China would make no promise to abandon the use of force, and he also made some similar comments about potentially using force against anyone who might intervene on Taiwan's behalf. And so analysts and observers and government officials are all trying to make sense of these trends and to figure out or assess whether China might actually use force against Taiwan sometime in the foreseeable future. The debate has been widespread, encompassing analysts and officials. U.S. senior military officers have weighed into this debate as well, and they've come to different public conclusions. On one hand, we have folks like former Indo-Pacific Commander Admiral Davidson, who stated that he thought that China might be ready to use force within the next 6 years, pointing to 2027 modernization deadline for the PLA. And his successor, Admiral Aquilino, has made similar comments. And then on the other hand, we have folks who are a little bit more cautious and reserved on this question, including Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, who has said on a few occasions that he thinks that an amphibious invasion of Taiwan would be extremely complicated, and so don't necessarily think that this is likely to happen in the near term. And so how can we make sense of these questions? All right, so today's talk, which will unfold over the next maybe hour or so, is getting at this key point here that I'll try to drive home in a few different segments. So my argument here is that Taiwan faces an increasingly confident and capable opponent, but there's still time for Taipei, in coordination with the U.S., to influence Xi Jinping's and the CCP's risk calculus through stronger defenses. So the sky is not falling. We're not likely to see a Chinese invasion tomorrow, but there is a very serious challenge, and we need to shine a spotlight on it and to understand its dimensions. And so what I'm going to do is to make this point kind of in 5 parts. First, I'll talk about where Taiwan fits within the context of China's larger military strategy. Second, I will talk about the spectrum of PLA operations, both things they're already doing and things they could do across the Taiwan Strait. Third, I will discuss some of the implications of recent military reforms on the PLA's ability to conduct operations across the strait. Fourth, I'll talk about some of the continuing challenges and weaknesses for the PLA in operating across the strait. And then finally, I'll make some comments about the US and Taiwan and sort of defense policy. And I should caveat that by saying that all of this is just simply my own personal opinion, and I'm not here to represent the US government or the Department of Defense. All right, so let me start with China's military strategy and context. Let me kind of begin by stating the obvious, which is that the PLA sort of has two goals, two sort of different but interrelated objectives with respect to Taiwan. First is deterrence. What they're really trying to do is to use military coercion alongside other tools of government and policy to try to deter more overt steps towards formal Taiwan independence. They're also trying to dissuade or ward off closer political military cooperation between Taiwan and the United States. So that's sort of goal number one. The more ambitious goal is that they need to be able to actually go to war, to either bring the Taiwan leadership to the negotiating table and compel them to accept a vision of unification dictated by mainland China. And barring that, they need to be able to seize and actually occupy the island, which also includes the task of delaying, deterring, or defeating U.S. Or other foreign intervention into the Western Pacific on Taiwan's behalf. So that's sort of the basic objective today, but that wasn't always really the case. And Taiwan has been it's had a different status in China's military strategy over the years. If we go all the way back to 1949, 1950, certainly Mao was preparing to seize Taiwan. The US intervened and made that an impossible goal. During most of the Cold War, mainland China was obsessed with the threat of intervention or invasion by the United States or the Soviet Union. So they were basically preparing for large-scale ground combat on their northern borders and elsewhere. And it really wasn't until the early 1990s that the PLA started getting serious once again about Taiwan. And the reason for that are, I would argue, twofold. First of all, China writ large was amending, improving relations with the United States, and they had also done so with the Soviet Union. And then the collapse of the Cold War meant that that former Soviet threat along the northern border no longer existed. And so they could therefore turn their attention to other regional problems. Secondly, on Taiwan, there was a growing Taiwan independence movement, a new generation of leaders that were not born in mainland China and did not see as much of a future with the mainland. And related to that, the United States was also upping its military sales and posture to Taiwan. And so the trends were going sort of in the wrong direction. And so from the early 1990s, Taiwan really became a central focus for China's military strategy for these reasons. This slide basically gives some information about China's formal strategy, and Taylor Fravel, also who's had some association with CWP, has written really extensively about this. China's military strategy addresses the question of who, where, and how the PLA is expected to fight. And so, as I've discussed, the who and the where has gradually shifted towards the southeast, towards Taiwan. The how of fighting has also changed, more or less from being able to repel a large-scale land invasion to be able to fight offshore, to be able to fight high-intensity, high-tech joint operations against regional opponents. And so they've also derived quite a number of lessons from the United States and from the Gulf War and other experiences to modify and adapt. So China's military strategy undergoes occasional revision, and Taylor Fravel's book goes through the 2014 revision. And I just want to mention briefly that I've done some work with Taylor updating this analysis to look at the most recent update to the military strategic guidelines, which is the formal name of China's military strategy, which was adopted in 2019. And what we found is simply that most of the key judgments remain the same, that the PLA was still very much focused on Taiwan and on the threat of U.S. intervention. The primary theater of warfare remained the southeast coast, where Taiwan is located, and the form of operations, the types of wars that they're preparing to fight have remained more or less high-tech local wars with a very strong emphasis on joint operations, operations involving more than one service, and which I'll talk about here in a moment. So that being said, kind of the major caveat or wrinkle here is that China's military strategy has to accomplish a lot of other things. So they may focus on Taiwan, and this must be a major set of issues and imperatives for them. But at the same time, China, of course, faces numerous challenges at other points along its periphery. And so the PLA also needs to be able to defend borders and even to be able to plan and train for and conduct operations against other opponents. And so the graphic here on this slide is drawn from China's defense white papers, typically released every other year. And those white papers just simply give a sense of the breadth and the geographic scope of the challenges that the CCP leadership faces. So Taiwan independence, of course, is a very consistent challenge, but there are also many other issues that crop up periodically and over time that the PLA needs to focus on as well, including instability on the Korean Peninsula, including problems in the East China Sea from Japan, problems in the South China Sea. Afghanistan has once again reared its ugly head. And so Chinese military strategy is not simply the same thing as a strategy for Taiwan. It's broader than that. But the Taiwan mission set occupies a very central and very important position within that overall strategy. Okay, so let me get into the question of different kinds of operations that the PLA is preparing for, in some cases already conducting, but at least preparing for across the Taiwan Strait in pursuit of those two objectives, deterrence and warfighting. So at the low end of the spectrum, we have what we might call peacetime coercion. So this is all the kinds of military operations and activities that the PLA conducts normally in peacetime, does not involve the use of lethal force, does not involve actually conquering any new territory. And there are several different ways that the PLA is going about this. And on this slide, I have a few different examples of kind of peacetime military coercion, which, as I noted at the outset, seems to be increasing in frequency and in scale. On the upper left, we have the image of a bomber, H-6K bomber flight that was conducted in the vicinity of Taiwan 5 years ago. This has become quite commonplace. What was interesting about this particular flight was that the photo of the flight that they released on social media actually is a manipulated image. And you will see in the background, supposedly the island of Taiwan, but in reality, that particular flight did not, as far as I know, come anywhere close to Taiwan. And yet it suggested that the PLA Air Force was operating extremely close to Taiwan without any opposition. And so this is an example of using a military operation in reality and combining it with a kind of information warfare to threaten and to intimidate the Taiwan public. On the top right, we have an image of an amphibious exercise held off the Chinese coast about a year ago. This is also not particularly unusual. The PLA conducts many amphibious exercises, but what was interesting was that they released quite a lot of detail about this particular exercise. And the reason I think analysts think is that the timing was that the U.S. had at that point just dispatched a cabinet official to Taiwan, which was from a Chinese point of view, an affront. And so the Chinese decided to start publicizing more of these exercises, again, as a show that they were taking this problem seriously. And then finally on the bottom are images from the 2019 October 1st National Day parade in Beijing. So this is what we might call as analysts selective transparency. So the PLA is very opaque, but in some cases they choose to reveal certain capabilities. And in the context of parades, they often show new capabilities designed, of course, to intimidate foreign audiences. And in this case, one of the things they selectively revealed was the DF-17, which is a long-range missile, a hypersonic fitted long-range ballistic missile. And of course, the rationale for that was to intimidate the United States because those missiles pose a very serious threat to U.S. positions in the Western Pacific. And on the right is the DF-21D, which is often known as a carrier killer because it's designed to target and strike and destroy U.S. aircraft carriers. So all these are different ways that the PLA has been pursuing peacetime coercion. So what are the advantages of these kinds of operations? There are several. First is discouraging overt moves towards de jure independence, and that seems to have been fairly successful with respect to Taiwan not going down that path too much. They sow doubt about the U.S. ability to intervene and the U.S. Willpower to intervene by raising questions about whether the U.S. military can actually intervene within an acceptable margin of risk on behalf of Taiwan. These sorts of exercises and operations often increase the readiness of PLA units. The PLA has a 2-year conscription cycle, and so they need to keep that readiness muscle alive and build that and strengthen it every year as part of their annual training cycle. These things are also a political signal of seriousness to China's own domestic public. They are a way for Xi and the CCP leadership to show that they care and they're serious and they're doing something about this problem. Not using lethal force is a way to minimize international opposition. So no one's imposing sanctions on China or really doing anything of that nature as pushback. And so the cost is fairly low. And then finally, increasing the scale and the intensity and the scope of these operations normalizes those things. So if you do a large scale bomber operation around Taiwan once, people pay attention, but by the 7th or 8th time, no one really pays attention anymore, and it becomes normalized, and the costs become lower to keep doing that. The problem is that from the perspective of pursuing unification, which is that larger and more ambitious goal, none of these things have really made a dent in Taiwan opinion. Support for unification on Taiwan remains marginal. Maybe 1.5% of the population wants it. There's actually been a jump in folks on Taiwan who want to move from the status quo eventually to independence. There's been a notable jump on that. And then there's also been a fairly high consistency in folks who want to maintain the status quo indefinitely. And so if military coercion is aiming at convincing Taiwan to come to the negotiating table or scaring the Taiwan public into wanting unification, it's not having that effect. It's certainly dampening the appetite for immediate de jure independence, but it has not had the effect of promoting a stronger attitude or appetite for unification with China. So as we move up the ladder and to more complex operations across the Taiwan Strait, we can envision something that the PLA actually has not done recently, is to seize one of Taiwan's smaller offshore islands. And I say recently because the PLA has actually done this. Back in the first Taiwan Strait crisis in 1955, they did seize one of the offshore islands. But in recent years, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of concern and debate about whether the PLA might actually be moving towards seizing one of these offshore islands. Taiwan has quite a few of them. Some are large, some are small, some are occupied, some unoccupied. Geographically, most of these islands are fairly close to Taiwan. Some are in the Taiwan Strait. Others are in the East China Sea or in the South China Sea. Taiping Island is significantly farther away in the South China Sea. And so there are quite a number of different kinds of targets if the PLA wanted to do this. Some additional detail just to underscore the diversity of Taiwan's offshore islands. Some are unoccupied. So Taiping Island in the South China Sea is unoccupied even by the military. Others have a very, very large civilian population. And so landing on these different kinds of islands would impose different sorts of requirements and risks for the PLA. But in general, I think what we can say about a potential seizure of a smaller offshore island is that there are a number of potential benefits or rewards. First of all, for the most part, this is feasible. In my view, and I believe in the Department of Defense's view as well, that this is certainly within the PLA's capability to land on and occupy one of these smaller islands. It would be a signal of a more serious commitment to unification. This would require more resources and risk than just simply flying bombers around Taiwan. It could potentially serve as a blow to Taiwan morale. It would certainly provide combat experience for the PLA, especially if there is organized opposition. It would also test Taiwan's defenses. So what kind of defense would Taiwan throw up? It would also test U.S. resolve. Would the U.S. actually intervene? This would certainly be framed as a propaganda of victory. Since the operation would likely be successful, it would be framed as a major victory for Xi and his legacy. And depending on the island, it may also provide an additional location for the PLA to build military infrastructure or mass forces, thereby providing an advantage if they were to take the next step and target the main island of Taiwan proper. And yet, the PLA hasn't done this, and the reason I think is because there are all sorts of different risks that would be involved in doing it. One would be international condemnation, especially if there were loss of life. This would potentially involve sanctions on China and certainly diplomatic opposition. It may actually serve to galvanize Taiwan independence rather than dampening it. It may actually push them in the opposite direction. It may actually also increase the chance of U.S. Strategic and military commitments to Taiwan, which have been somewhat restrained and ambiguous in the past. It may push the U.S. more towards strategic clarity. There may also be domestically more of an increased expectation that the PLA would take the next step, which would be a full-scale invasion of Taiwan, and perhaps they're not prepared to do so. And then finally, the PLA, although they may ultimately succeed, they may suffer some setbacks as well that could involve casualties and other sorts of losses. So as we move up the spectrum of operations, the PLA also plans for several different kinds of major combat operations across the Taiwan Strait. And we can talk about several different campaigns that the PLA has been writing about and training for the last 20 years or so. Kind of at the low end would be a large-scale missile bombardment of Taiwan. This would leverage China's massive short-range missile arsenal against Taiwan sites, could be military targets or political targets. The goal would be to intimidate Taiwan's leaders and bring them to the negotiating table with a swift blow. And yet there would also be certain risks. including casualties and emboldening Taiwan. The PLA also plans for a blockade of Taiwan that would also leverage China's numerical superiority in naval and Coast Guard assets to impose a blockade against the island and potentially starve them until they decided to come to the negotiating table. And yet the risks of this would include, again, international condemnation and sanctions. And this would also be a fairly clear warning to the United States about China's intentions, and the U.S. would therefore have a bit of a leg up and start moving forces to the region. And so if that failed, China might move up to a actual joint island landing campaign. So this is what really gets all the attention. So this would be amphibious, in other words, over the beach, or it could be airborne, so by airplane, to occupy the island. There are some risks involved. These are very complicated operations, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. The probability of success is somewhat lower because of the difficulties in crossing the strait successfully. And so if the invasion failed, there could be significant political risk, certainly to Xi Jinping's legacy, but also to him personally, if someone else in the leadership decided this was the chance to pounce on him. And then finally, the PLA trains for what they would call a joint anti-air raid campaign. And so this is the use of different kinds of military assets to target forces that are attacking China. So this would be taking out U.S. Bases in the region and U.S. Forces operating across the water. And so this is part and parcel integral to those other campaigns. And so again, these could be done sequentially. So China may start at one end and move up if Taiwan's leaders resisted, or they could be done in combination and done very quickly together. So the main weakness, though, of the first two, I think, is that it wouldn't necessarily get the job done. So really, to guarantee a victory, you have to be able to occupy Taiwan island proper. And so that's why we put so much attention on the island landing campaign. And then finally, there's even a stage above that, and that would be what happens after you land forces on the island and there's resistance. And so this is something that Chinese doctrinal writings doesn't address very thoroughly or specifically. But really what they would have to do would be to be able to go into those urban areas and other parts of the island and to maintain a social order or social control, just as they have been doing domestically in Xinjiang. And so they have been practicing urban warfare training. They have been studying how the U.S. did it in Iraq and other places. And so they're putting some of the pieces in together, but that hasn't really been fully wrapped into the larger doctrine. It's not clear from writings about the island landing campaign sort of what happens if there's resistance. And so they're, in my view, trying to pull some of those pieces together at present. Okay, so in lieu of talking extensively about PLA hardware and force structure, I'm going to make some comments here about improvements in Chinese military structure over the last 5 years or so that are particularly relevant to the PLA's ability to conduct joint operations across the Taiwan Strait, whether it's a small island landing or whether it's actually any of the campaigns that I just mentioned against the main island of Taiwan. So the bottom line of this discussion is going to be that historically it's been very, very difficult for the PLA to actually think about moving from concept to reality in terms of joint operations. The PLA was very ground force centric. Most of the battles they actually fought during the Cold War were single service battles. They didn't really have the need to fight jointly. And there was also quite a big army sort of mentality that the ground forces were dominant, resources that went to the Air Force, the Navy, and other parts of the PLA were fairly limited. And so jointness was really a struggle for them, just as it's been a struggle for other militaries as well. And yet in the last 5 years, this is a known weakness. They have made quite a number of adjustments to try to improve themselves organizationally to be able to plan, train for, and conduct joint operations. So what we have here is sort of the top level view of the command and control structure for the PLA. So what I want to mention here is that prior to 2015, when Xi Jinping began this process of reforms, the PLA command structure was really heavily balkanized. There wasn't really a joint command per se. The service headquarters, the services basically did their own thing. The Navy headquarters led naval operations and so on. What they did in 2015 was to take command and control of operations and to place those into joint headquarters. And so at the national level, they now have a joint staff department that deals with sort of national level command and control. And then in terms of the theaters, they have moved from 7 military regions to 5 theater commands. And the 5 theater commands are each focused on a specific set of regional contingencies. And so the Eastern Theater Command, which I'll talk about in a second, is primarily responsible for cross-strait operations. And so the Eastern Theater Commander now actually has at his disposal all of the normal forces that you would need to conduct peacetime coercion. So he has under his control Air Force, Naval, Ground Forces, Marines. And so in peacetime, he can conduct contingency planning, he can orchestrate a joint training, and he can, if there ever were a crisis, move fairly rapidly from peacetime to wartime operations. And that's a significant shift because prior to these reforms, if the PLA was going to transition from peacetime to wartime, you would have actually had to create a new command structure on an ad hoc basis. So they would have required weeks and months to get all of those pieces into place. But now they have all of that architecture already in place. So if they need to quickly move from a peacetime to a wartime footing, all those command relationships are already in place and the authorities are fairly clear. There are some exceptions, which I'll talk about later, but this is a much more streamlined and efficient, and I would say U.S. style of command arrangement than existed in the past. And that is completely relevant to each of the major joint campaigns that the PLA is envisioning conducting across the Taiwan Strait. And so this isn't just a matter of re-wickering those organizational diagrams. Jointness is complicated. It's not just about having the organizations in place. It's also about the abilities of commanders to think across service boundaries. It's about having a kind of joint mentality and a lot of proficiency in being able to operate together. And so the PLA has also been making a number of related changes to promote jointness. First, in terms of training, they have increased the scale and the frequency of joint training, so training involving multiple services. They have moved more towards a joint personnel system, so they are appointing non-ground force officers into very senior positions. And then finally, they are changing and adapting their professional military education system to focus more on joint operations. And so all of this is interdependent. You need all of this in place if your commanders and your staff officers can think jointly, plan jointly, and be able to train and conduct operations. And so this is a very important prerequisite if they're actually going to think about executing any of those campaigns. At the same time, there are a number of other major organizational changes afoot inside the PLA that are relevant to cross-strait operations that are collectively, I would argue, putting the PLA on a stronger organizational footing to be able to conduct higher level operations. The creation of the Strategic Support Force in 2016 is important because that consolidated PLA capabilities for space, cyber, electronic warfare, and psychological warfare. So collectively, the information domain, if you will, which is very significant for any kind of cross-strait operation. Logistics, which doesn't get nearly enough attention. China has adapted and reformed its logistics structure into a new outfit called the Joint Logistics Support Force. And so these folks are responsible in wartime for providing continuous logistics and sustainment and transportation for the Eastern Theater. So they're a very critical player. The PLA has also instituted a number of below the neck, sort of lower level reforms to their organizational structure that improves mobility and flexibility in warfighting, most notably the shift from divisions, so these large Soviet-style formations, to brigades. They have also standardized a number of the ground force brigades, including the 6 that would be the primary landing force for a Taiwan invasion. They have standardized those. And they have also made some important reforms to the airborne corps, which would be also quite critical in getting troops across the Taiwan Strait. Okay, so the PLA is under reform. They are also clearly modernizing their force structure, and they're in a stronger position than they were 5, 10, or 15 years ago to conduct these operations. But this is still not a piece of cake. They have a number of different challenges that they're wrestling with. And so here I'm going to talk about 5 different things, 5 challenges that I believe they are wrestling with. And I will describe the challenge, but also what I assess to be their way of mitigating or reducing those challenges. So first of all, the problem that gets probably the most amount of attention in the press and in analysis is insufficient lift. So the PLA actually doesn't have, despite the size of its Navy and Air Force, they don't actually have enough specialized naval transport ships or air cargo planes to get the entire landing force across the strait. The information here is drawn from a chapter in an upcoming volume on cross-strait operations that we are about to publish early next year. And what our analysis found was that they only have enough military transport to get about half the troops across, and enough cargo plane capacity to get perhaps a third of the airborne troops across. And so this is a challenge. It's a known problem, and it's something that they're working on. And they're working on it partly by increasing production of some of those assets, but also they, especially in terms of naval transportation, are thinking more critically about using civilian ships as part of China's civilian merchant fleet to be able to enlist and bring in those ships and to have them carry some of the heavy equipment and troops across the Taiwan Strait as well. This is a little bit of a harder problem for airborne because you can't just, let's say, kick troops out of a UPS plane or something. You actually have to have dedicated military cargo. And yet this isn't an insurmountable problem. They can just simply ramp up production of planes like the Y9 or the Y20 to have that sort of capacity. So this is a known problem, but in my view, it's one of the easiest for them to resolve. Second would be difficult landing conditions. So Taiwan is not Iraq in 1990. It's not a great big desert. It's a very, very difficult terrain that moves quickly from ocean to beach to urban to jungle to mountain. It's difficult to operate in. There are only so many number of viable landing sites for an amphibious landing. And there's also notoriously bad weather that plagues the Taiwan Strait. And so all of these things advantage Taiwan's defenders. This is also quite well known to the PLA. So how are they thinking about this problem? I would argue that they are thinking about it by putting less emphasis than we might imagine on the amphibious forces and more so on troops that can simply be carried across in airplanes. So those airborne troops. And what they would, I think, likely do is to fly across seas and airfield, make it viable, and then flow a number of forces and heavy equipment that way. And so that also requires significant special operations troops that would go in and facilitate those sorts of operations. And that's something that I've done a bit of work on. So if there are any questions about PLA special operations, that could maybe be held into the Q&A. A third problem would be a lack of combat experience. This is a problem for the PLA that is often discussed, and analysts come to different conclusions about how serious of a problem this is. The facts are that the PLA has not fought a major conflict since the Vietnam border incursion in 1979. So it's been 40 years. There's almost no one around that experienced any of that. And the PLA has been very critical of the ability of its commanders. They talk about commanders suffering from the peace disease, being too complacent, not having the right mentality. And so this is a challenge that, of course, they can't really fully solve without actually going to war, but they can make up some of the deficit, I think, through increasingly complicated training, including use of opposition force training and other sorts of complex and challenging training exercises. They have been making better use of war games and simulations. They have been weeding out poor performing commanders. And in fact, there is some evidence that Xi Jinping himself has become seized of getting involved in promotions and going down perhaps even to the level of corps commanders and selecting based on some of these criteria folks who he thinks will do a pretty good job in future battles. Another problem would be sort of the PLA's organizational culture, which is drawn from a Leninist model of a highly centralized decision-making process and deference to higher level authorities. And the argument, the implication is that the PLA and commanders on the ground might be relatively risk averse. They might not do things without securing high level approval. They might not be able to be very flexible or innovative on the battlefield, and this would slow their pace of operations and tie them down, especially if they face difficult problems on the battlefield. Related to this also, I talked about the organizational reforms earlier, but what I want to mention here is that the Eastern Theater Command, although more empowered than his predecessor, still lacks direct peacetime control over several major forces that he would need to employ in a cross-strait operation, including the Strategic Support Force, the Joint Logistics Support Force, the Airborne Corps, and the People's Armed Police. So he actually doesn't control any of those forces and would have to ask for help. And so that's it's a potential weakness if he is not able to draw on those assets regularly in peacetime. And yet there are some solutions to this. The PLA has been conducting some major, national level exercises. These have been publicly reported to test the new command and control structure, to be able to go and handle a Taiwan Strait while handling other sorts of regional challenges at the same time. They have done some of those exercises already. They have also, I think it's fair to say, placed some of their best and most trusted and capable commanders in the Eastern Theater Command, again, with Xi Jinping himself personally sometimes getting involved in those sorts of decisions. And so I think they sort of recognize this as a problem, although at a certain level, it's hard to transform the PLA's organizational culture fundamentally from Leninist to a U.S. style system, but they're trying their best anyway. I'm going to skip over this slide in the interest of time and move over to the last problem, which is outdated doctrine. So earlier I talked about several canonical types of PLA campaigns, the bombardment, the blockade, the island landing, and the anti-air raid. Most of the information about these campaigns is really from about 2005 or so, the last period of time in which the PLA overhauled its doctrine. And so training is based on doctrine, and if your doctrine is outdated, then to some degree your training will also be outdated. And so what they need to do is to update those doctrinal regulations. And the latest information that we have from Chinese sources is that they are in the process of doing that. They have already released a new joint operations outline last year, about a year ago, and it seems likely that they are likely to take that framework and develop more refined and updated contingency plans for Taiwan operations. But without all that being in place, it's not clear whether or not their current doctrine takes into account new organizations, new capabilities, and so on. Okay, so at this point, I've talked about important changes in the PLA, but also some of the lingering weaknesses. The fact that they're still wrestling with some of these key challenges, I think, means that Taiwan still has a kind of window of opportunity to improve its defenses for the purpose of altering and complicating Xi Jinping's and the CCP's risk calculus. And so let me talk through some of those sorts of issues here in the last 10 minutes or so. So Taiwan's defense approach is certainly in a period of transition. They are no longer preparing for a symmetrical fight across the Taiwan Strait, fighter against fighter, ship against ship. They're fighting for a different kind of battle, they're fighting for more of an asymmetrical battle where their main goal is to stop China, stop the PLA from being able to cross the strait. And by demonstrating their ability to do that, deterring or dissuading Xi Jinping from making that decision in the first place. And so Taiwan's defense experts have been putting more emphasis on discrete, mobile, concealable, survivable kinds of assets that would slow a Chinese invasion force, including things like coastal defense cruise missiles, smart sea mines, stingers, which would target those airborne forces, and ways to tie it all together through integrated air and missile defenses. And so if we look at a lot of Taiwan's recent arms sales from the United States, a lot of that stuff fits into this sort of asymmetric defense approach. And that's what I think a lot of US analysts have encouraged Taiwan to do, to put their limited defense resources into these sorts of assets that would really cause the PLA to think twice about escalating to the use of force. This new approach up until recently was known as the overall defense concept, and it was championed by some folks in Taiwan, including former Chief of the General Staff, Li Shiming. There are some weaknesses that have been talked about and discussed with respect to this approach. First of all, it puts a very heavy emphasis on countering a PLA invasion, and yet that's not the only mission that Taiwan's military needs to conduct. Taiwan's military also needs to be able to resist a Chinese blockade. They need to be able to respond to peacetime coercion. So that includes going up and challenging PLA fighters that enter Taiwan's air defense identification zone. They need to be able to protect and see areas near Taiwan in peacetime. And they need to be able to fight an extended, even potentially an extended conflict post-landing. But the overall defense concept doesn't really discuss or prioritize resources that are relevant to any of those sorts of missions too. And so some folks in Taiwan would say that it's too narrow and needs to be broadened. This also gets to the question of Taiwan service equities. So the Navy, the Air Force, the Army in Taiwan are similar to their counterparts anywhere. They like big, expensive procurements. The Air Force likes to have fighters. The Navy likes to have destroyers and things like this. These are all very, very expensive. These are prestige items, and they cost, the costs are really disproportionate in the view of many analysts to their benefits. And yet those service equities, those bureaucratic interests come into play and potentially make acquisition less efficient from an operational point of view. Defense spending has been somewhat of a notorious problem for Taiwan. Their level of defense spending to GDP has been quite low, in the low single digits. Current President Tsai Ing-wen has promised to and has overseen an increase in the defense budget, but I think many would argue that compared to Taiwan's defense needs, the amount that they're actually spending on defense remains quite small. And then in terms of human capital, Taiwan is undergoing a shift from a conscript force where people have to serve to an all-volunteer force, which is more professional, and you have NCOs, and this is kind of how modern militaries do business. And yet attracting and retaining that workforce has proven very difficult. Taiwan has a small population at a very, very low birth rate. And so it's difficult, and it's hard to know where they will be getting the human capital and expertise they need to be able to orchestrate an effective defense in the future. So with respect to the United States, the challenge from China is fairly well known. The PLA is certainly undergoing modernization focused on platforms and systems designed to keep the United States out of the Western Pacific, to be able to hinder and obstruct US operations. And a lot of the attention is on missile systems such as that DF-17, which target US bases, including Guam, but which may also be able to target US surface ships as well. And so, there's a lot of discussion about the anti-access area denial environment that the US has to be able to operate in. So this is a known challenge for the United States. It's not something that anyone is waking up new to today. The services, the U.S. services, I think it's fair to say, have been adapting, and they have also been revising their own service doctrine to be able to operate more effectively and to intervene and sustain forces, whether it's for Taiwan or a different regional actor. And so there has been a lot of adaptation and transition in the last few years. A lot of this is based around the need to operate more in a distributed fashion, so to avoid reliance on large overseas bases, to be able to operate across great distances very quickly, to be able to conceal forces, to be able to move forces around very, very quickly, and so on. And so these are sort of the principles of the U.S. staying in this game. At present, it's sort of a question of merging different service doctrines into a joint doctrine. And so the U.S. is undergoing a process of revising those joint operational plans where you're bringing in assets from all the different services to be able to intervene effectively within an acceptable margin of risk. Of course, folks, I think, realize this is a very, very difficult problem, but there's a lot of, I would say, a lot of brain power going into this question at present, and I think there will be more to follow on that front. So let me finally talk here about what all of this means for U.S. Taiwan coordination. And so, over the last decade or two, the focus has been on U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. As I mentioned earlier, the focus, the nature of some of those arms sales is starting to shift to better align with Taiwan's asymmetric defense approach. But I would also argue that there are a number of other things that the U.S. and Taiwan should be considering doing jointly or collectively to be able to improve Taiwan's defenses in peacetime. First of all, as a matter of principle, my view is that coordination between the two sides should be results-oriented and pragmatic, and not geared towards a political grandstanding and signals, empty gestures that don't actually improve Taiwan's defenses. So that's a matter of general principle. Within that, there are several things also that I think should be done. First of all, would be to continue the move towards supplying, whether it's selling or providing arms to Taiwan that are aligned with that asymmetric defense approach, whether it's stingers or sea mines or you name it, things like this. Sharing strategic assessments, whether or not China would use force, it really comes down to an assessment of their intentions. And I think Taiwan and the U.S. are likely thinking about this differently. I think there are conversations that should be had about how both sides see the strategic environment and how they would assess and understand any potential move by China to use force. So collaborating to some degree on indications and warning, I think, would be helpful. In addition to that, I think the U.S. can continue to provide Taiwan some level of assistance in building its reserve forces, which would be called out and would be critical and need to be able to function, as well as Taiwan's military logistics capabilities. So how exactly would they weather a blockade? I think that's also a conversation that the U.S. can leverage expertise to Taiwan's benefit. Focusing on Chinese special operations, again, and airborne, I think these are areas that don't get nearly enough attention compared to the amphibious, but these are also areas where I think the U.S. can probably provide some advice on how best to protect those airfields and resist PLA special operations forces. Being able to compete in the information environment, this is critical to Chinese operations in peacetime or wartime. I think the two sides need to talk candidly about how we can change the narrative and maintain information dominance. And then finally, something that's gotten more attention in the press of late would be the role of other actors. And I'm thinking in particular about Japan, and there have been certain signals that Japan might want to become better integrated into defense planning for Taiwan contingencies to some degree. And bringing in Japan in a way that is comfortable and suitable for Tokyo, I think would ultimately be beneficial for this problem set. All right, so I've talked a lot, so why don't I turn the floor back over to Tom and take some questions.
Thanks a lot, Joel. It was a great, very comprehensive talk, and I'm happy that we have a report coming out from the Asia Society and UC San Diego tomorrow. It'll be rolled out. and it has a military section that I participated in with some co-authors, and I was pleased that you didn't contradict us too harshly. So, because you're a real expert, and it's great to be in agreement with you. I wanted to press you on a couple of things. I've read some of the questions, and one of them will come up in my own initial comments. One is about the analysis of invasion, and one of the things I'm always concerned about in U.S. Military analysis, both civilian and uniformed analysis, is projecting U.S. views on how things should be done onto others. And I say that because I'm primarily concerned about deterrence and preventing a conflict from happening. And I sometimes think that American analysts might say, well, they're not ready for an amphibious invasion, or they're not ready for an airborne invasion, or a combination of a airborne and amphibious invasion, because they don't have all of the capabilities that we would want if we were doing the same thing that they're about to prepare to do. And I wonder if you can maybe shed some light on their own thought process about what they might need as a kind of minimum requirement to try to attempt such efforts, even if we would feel uncomfortable with those levels. And that would, of course, not necessarily be crucial for the warfighting scenario, but it'd be all important for the deterrence scenario, because the whole idea is to make it seem to them like it's not worth it, right? So that's a broad question about the invasion scenarios. But I wanted to press you on alternatives to those scenarios. You mentioned blockade before, and in your discussion of Taiwan's preparation and U.S. preparation, you didn't talk much about preparing for a blockade. And I think there's a reason. I think it's very difficult to prepare for a blockade. And I'm afraid that neither Taiwan nor the United States is particularly well prepared to counter a blockade over time. And I'd maybe talk about that. And the second is cyber. And I know Ian Johnson raised this in his question online. What if it was a non-kinetic cyber attack that either made Taiwan dark and hot, or targeted particular agencies or leaders with kind of terror threats or something like that. So that's another alternative. And then finally, the only thing that I would say that I think is not right in your talk is the map. You had a map early on with the various island groups. And the one thing that's wrong, and this is the basis of my question, is the Penghus are in the wrong place. So the Penghus are very close to Taiwan. And my understanding is they're a county of Taiwan. So if the mainland were to seize the Penghus, it would be different than seizing Quemoy and Matsu, Jinmen and Matsu, which are part of Fujian province on the mainland. And I just wonder psychologically if that's another option. You have possibility of a blockade, possibility of a cyber attack, or possibility of a very dramatic amphibious attack, but not on the main island of Taiwan, but on the Penghus close to Taiwan, as a kind of way of getting inside the heads of the Taiwan population and the leadership. I know it's a long question and it's got a lot of elements, but then I'll turn to others after I get my initial chair's question out. So.
Okay, great. All right, thanks. So let me start with the first part on the amphibious and whether or not, we may be kind of reading a bit of U.S. History or U.S. Experience into this. First of all, I think, it's notable that the U.S. Marine Corps, as far as I know, isn't actually preparing for amphibious operations across contested beaches anymore. This is sort of, people think of the Normandy invasion of things like this and maybe imagine that a PLA invasion of Taiwan would look very similar to that. I don't think that we should have that mindset. I think, different folks, including people like Lonnie Henley, have made the case that actually an invasion would be multifaceted. It wouldn't solely or even necessarily primarily rely on troops crossing the Taiwan Strait in boats. And so I suspect that, what we would see and what we will see in the future is additional training that seeks to combine airborne assets as well as special operations troops that, as I said, I think are probably underappreciated. Those forces have been also undergoing some important reforms. But one of the things that they need to do a better job of, in my view, and I'm not giving the PLA advice, but I think they recognize that these forces are not actually integrated very well into joint training. They're certainly not integrated into the joint command structure, but they also tend not to be involved in any kind of joint training. And so the Airborne Corps needs to get involved in those high-level joint exercises and so on. And so that would be something of an indication that they're taking that more seriously. In terms of a blockade, yeah, I think you're right. This is a very difficult problem to solve. The only thing that I would mention, and to kind of reiterate about this, would be that, Taiwan's defense approach is really, really heavily focused like a laser on the cross-beach invasion. And they don't really discuss too much about the blockade. I think, they should. I think, U.S. certainly has quite a lot of logistic expertise that could be of value here. If we can talk about how do you, stockpile necessary, critical munitions and critical assets and do that comprehensively and strategically, then I think, if you can demonstrate some of that capability, then that would also serve a useful deterrent purpose. For Ian, in terms of cyber, I think this is already ongoing. I think, this is part of the low-level conflict that is already going on across the Taiwan Strait and may escalate in the context of a war. We have a chapter in our latest NDU Press volume by Taiwan scholar Yingyu Lin, who has looked at that and basically said that Chinese hackers have already made their way into Taiwan's critical infrastructure. This is a kind of a known problem in Taiwan, but if they have that sort of access, to some degree they might show it, but to a large degree they might not show it. And so if the balloon ever goes up and there's a conflict across the strait, some of those hidden accesses might be the first switches that they throw to, as you say, make Taiwan hot and dark. Again, this is a problem. One of the problems they face, though, is that the strategic support force, which is responsible for those operations, actually is not particularly well integrated with the theater. And so I wonder about coordination between those forces and how well they plan together. Finally, with respect to the Punghus, yeah, I was doing this very quickly in Google Maps, and I think I probably just messed it up. Yeah, the Punghus are close to Taiwan. This is an option for the PLA. So even if we look at offshore island seizure, there's sort of a spectrum of conflict even within that subset. And so seizing, a large, largely populated island very close to Taiwan would be on the high end of that particular spectrum, and the risks of doing that would be significantly greater from a military point of view than if you were simply going to seize Taiping Island, which is far away from Taiwan and not really defended. So yes, that would be a very strong signal, but it would also, it would raise the question about, what comes next. And if you are especially envisioning, civilian casualties and things like this, this would be a very, very risky choice, I think, for Xi than trying to occupy some unoccupied island in the South China Sea.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was great talk, great answer. And I guess, Daniel, do you want to take over the honors of pulling the questions offline, or do you want to read them yourself, Joel?
Yeah, do you feel comfortable reading them, Joel? I can read them to you and just keep it simple. Up to you.
Okay.
Just an announcement while he's reviewing. For anyone who has a question, please put it in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom link.
And please list your affiliation when you do it. We like to know who you are.
I'm seeing some information in the chat, but not the questions, Daniel. It could be I'm looking in the wrong place. Maybe if you have that, Daniel, and you can read the questions, maybe you can kind of steer the discussion that way.
Sure. Okay. So the first question is from Albert Goldson, who is the executive director of the Cerulean Council, a think tank based in New York City. And they ask, what is your perspective whether Taiwan and or the U.S. engage China military if China targets one or a handful of outer islands? I think we touched on this a little bit already, but.
Yeah, sorry, Daniel, I missed the first part of the question. Could you repeat it?
Sorry, yeah. What is your perspective whether Taiwan or the U.S. will engage China militarily if China targets one or a handful of the outer islands?
Whether Taiwan will engage militarily,
or the U.S. Yeah,
or the U.S. Well, I think it depends on which islands that we're talking about. Some of these, as I showed in the slide, are have a largish Taiwan garrison. Taiwan is also reforming its own command structure so that some of these islands will be placed under a sort of theater command structure. So if that's the case, I anticipate there would be resistance. If there is no active defense going on there, then it seems less likely than there would be an organized defense. The U.S., whether or not the U.S. would intervene is unclear, because we have a policy that we don't say what exactly we're going to do, even if the main island of Taiwan were attacked. And so if we're talking about outer islands, it's sort of ambiguous. And it's also a military question of whether or not, if China did something very, very quickly and, we woke up tomorrow and there were suddenly PLA troops on Taiping Island, then you have the choice of, evicting them or going to war with China over Taiping Island. So the context, I think, matters. The military status of troops matters. I would suspect that there would be more of a defense, just to wrap it up, with the larger civilian occupied islands.
The same person has a follow-up question. What scenarios would provoke or encourage, in your mind, China to invade Taiwan?
So this is really kind of a key political question, is under what condition would Xi Jinping and the CCP's risk calculus change so that the rewards of invasion outweigh the risks? We have different kind of theories about this. One would be if they view themselves to be in such a military predominant position that the risks are relatively small. At the higher end, I don't think that they believe that the risks are small. I think they believe that the U.S. would likely intervene, and that they would fairly quickly find themselves into a major conflict with the United States, and who knows where that could end up. Politically, though, it's a question of whether or not Xi Jinping thinks that there's an urgency to move from this initial goal of deterring Taiwan independence, which has been relatively successful, to that harder goal of actually making steps towards unification. Is there a political logic in the short term to want to do that outweighs the military, political, and economic risks? And it's not clear that what that circumstance would be. We can speculate about whether there is an economic collapse in China, whether there is a political crisis in China that makes this more of an attractive choice. If Taiwan changed its policy and actually made some extremely provocative or bold move towards de jure independence that would force Xi Jinping into a corner and force him to act. These are certain things, but none of these things have happened. And, really the risks of him, taking that decision at present, I think would be complicating and really damaging other aspects of his national strategy for rejuvenation by the middle of the century, which is primarily domestic economic reform, building a prosperous middle-class society, and so on. And if you want to put all your eggs in the Taiwan basket, you're really rolling the dice on whether you can achieve any of that other broader national agenda. And so I don't see a compelling political logic at present, but we can speculate about conditions under which that could change.
Certainly, there's a lot of moving pieces. Next question comes from Eli Clemens, who is a Columbia SIPA grad student, who themselves researches the PLA's SSF space capabilities. And they ask, can you speak some or a little bit more about China's military goals in space beyond the Taiwan Strait Eastern Theater Command?
So, and not being a specialist in this area, I think, what I can say is, first of all, in terms of access to space is, as it is for the United States, increasingly important for the PLA as it becomes more of a global military actor. As you move beyond the region, you increasingly need space, satellite capabilities for navigation, for weather, for communications, and so on. And so some level of strategic stability in space is very important. You don't want any of that capability to necessarily be targeted tomorrow, and then you can't operate abroad. Counter space is, of course, very important from the perspective of counter intervention. And the reason, of course, is that the U.S., from a Chinese perspective, they perceive that the U.S. ability to quickly move forces across the Western Pacific relies quite significantly on similar space systems, satellites, communications, and so on. And so if they are able to target through missiles, kinetic or non-kinetic means, U.S. satellites, then they would have a leg up. And in terms of deterring U.S. intervention, just simply demonstrating their ability to maybe do that, I think from their point of view, would be a card to make the U.S. think twice about whether it really wants to get into that. That being said, though, the U.S. is also seized of this problem and quite aware of it, and I think is taking some steps to diversify and to reduce sole reliance on space or cyber, for that matter, which is a very similar kind of problem set. So it's a bit of a two-faced issue. China wants to target space, but then they also need access to it just as we do. And so that creates incentives for them not to want the US to do the same thing to them. So it's complicated.
Next question comes from, and I apologize if I butcher this name, Venkantraman KK, who is a researcher with the Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi, India. And they have two questions. It's a two-part question. Has an assessment of the PLA's Hellfire capabilities and how it can supplement airlift and sea lift capabilities been carried out? Followed by, while the conventional forces can be quantified, are there any assessments of PLA SSF capabilities?
Yeah, so on the first part of your question, I have to admit that I haven't followed that. I don't know about current research on the Hellfires. With respect to the strategic support force, yes, I mean, there have been many, many assessments. This is really a hot topic in PLA studies. I can point you to a number of different things, but some of the best research actually has been done by John Costello and Joe McReynolds, who have gone into this in great detail organizationally and in terms of capabilities to better understand this very important new part of the PLA's arsenal.
Next question comes from Ian Johnson, the other co-director of the China World Program based at Harvard University. He says, great presentation, but your scenarios are mostly kinetic. Could one imagine a cyber-centric campaign as part of an initial political negotiation strategy? E.g., the demand is to think political negotiations with the implied outcome being something more unification, like unification. To accompany that demand, cyber forces could interfere with the stock market, media content, parts of crypto infrastructure, maybe even threatening Taiwanese political leaders individually in precise, though quiet ways by making personal threats delivered through the manipulation of personal electronics, including anything connected to the Internet of Things. All of this is technically possible, also more deniable and less escalatory. All the PLRC needs to do to get Taiwanese leaders to accept negotiations. Sounds crazy, maybe, but how cyber might be used to coerce is limited only by one's imagination. Thoughts?
Yes, and Daniel, I think this was also referenced in Tom's initial round of questions. I'll just say maybe one or two more words about it. So the dilemma, I think, for the PLA in terms of cyber campaigns in peacetime would be, how much of this access they really want to be able to reveal, because once they've pushed those buttons and have shown their ability to complicate the stock market or to affect the power grid or something like this, then Taiwan knows that the PLA can do this, and they start improving their defenses, and you lose that access. And so for the PLA, just like the U.S. or anyone else, you have some incentives to want to not, burn all those bridges initially, so that, if you're ever actually going to a kinetic conflict, you can pull out some of those ace cards and use them at the right moment and the right time, and not let the other guy, see it and prepare for it and defend against it. But, cyber campaigns without attribution, which is interesting because really who else would be targeting Taiwan? So I don't see that as such a big issue. But if there is, this sort of, lights go on and lights go off and so on, I don't see that changing or forcing Taiwan's leaders to a political negotiation. I think, it's something that underscores a certain threat from the PRC, but really what it does is motivate them to really take cyber defense very seriously and to put more resources into that problem, just as the US is doing with respect to China cyber as well.
Joel, the previous questioner was interested in helicopter lift because you had talked about air assault, and I don't know if you can talk about that or not, but I think that's one of the things he wanted you to address.
Okay, sure. So the helicopter forces, I mean, this is also critical to getting across the strait. They can, get across. It's whether or not, they're getting across in the Y-20s or the Y-9s, or whether or not they're getting across in helicopters. I don't have a lot of detail off the top of my head about the size or some of the latest equipment that they have. But I do know that in terms of the ground force modernization, really one of the top of the list is acquiring modern, Black Hawk type of helicopters. And, these are multi-mission, multi-function assets that could be used in anything from domestic disaster relief to crossing the border with India to Taiwan. And so I think these are high priority capabilities. But again, I don't know encyclopedically off the top of my head what the exact force structure looks like for the helicopters.
Our next question comes from a master's student in political science at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And once again, I apologize if I butchered the name, but it comes from Renato Gabriel Mendelbaum. And they would like to ask you if you believe the Quad may play an important role in protecting Taiwan from a possible Chinese invasion.
Yeah, so it's in terms of military coordination, I mean, I see the Quad as not so much a military alliance that would be doing four-sided, defense planning to resist a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I see this more as a broad alignment that focuses on economic goals and governance and democracy and things like this. And so, in peacetime, in the information landscape, the Quad may pipe up and mention stability in the Taiwan Strait, just as bilaterally the Japanese have been willing to do of late. But no, I don't see the Quad per se as being particularly relevant to Taiwan's defense from an invasion. That being said, the key partner there within the Quad would certainly be Japan, given the proximity of Taiwan to Japan's southwestern islands. I certainly don't see India playing a role in this, and I probably don't really see an Australian role in it either. So Japan, yes, Quad important for peacetime, but not so much necessarily for wartime contingency planning.
Next question comes from Trace Sprouse, who's an undergrad at Columbia College. What efforts are being undertaken to increase Taiwan's popular resilience or resolve in the case of PLA invasion? What impact or deterrence effects does Taiwan's popular sentiment have on Beijing's strategic calculus?
Yeah, and there's another question that's related to this from Enon Ho, and you can answer them both at once, Joel, I think. And hers is the kind of opposite, which is saying, is there really any resistance, and would Taiwan resist if a superior force were to attack it? What's your sense about Taiwan resilience? So I think you could probably address both of those in the same answer.
Yeah, so this is sort of a $64 million question is, if the PLA actually used force, would the Taiwanese public rally to the defense, or would they say, forget this, we can live with one country, two systems, or the costs of resisting are so high and astronomical that why bother? It's really, really unclear actually what would go on. I think, some of the information from this would be in terms of the coherence and the organization of Taiwan's reserve forces, which would be called out in this sort of contingency. So these would be the guys, actually on the street and trained to use military equipment and so on. And is that force coherent and well-led enough that it would actually operate? Or would we have, the Afghan National Security Forces and it just crumbles into dust despite some effort being paid to it? I don't think we really know. I don't have a good sense, and that analogy, by the way, has been made pretty frequently, most notably by Chinese propagandists. I don't think we should underestimate the motivation of the Taiwanese, but it's really a question that we can't really answer unless it actually happens. I think if you talk to people on the street, they would say, sure, we'll resist, or they'll say, I doubt it. But you can't take that to the bank. I think it's.
What do you think the PLA thinks? That's part of the question. In other words, it's fine for the Global Times to say the Afghan army collapsed and so will the Taiwan army. The U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan. The U.S. will not defend Taiwan. But what do you, from PLA writings you've seen, do you think that they see Taiwan as a tough nut or not?
I believe the doctrine indicates that they sense that the resistance would crumble relatively quickly. And, it's sort of written that way, to think that if they can effectively carry out a decapitation strike against Taiwan authorities, that organization and coherence would be so low that any kind of resistance would just sort of melt away and crumble. that's sort of the explanation for why they didn't add a counterinsurgency chapter to the doctrine on island landings in the science of campaigns. They just don't foresee it. And some folks who have done research on this kind of point to them looking to Iraq in 2003 as sort of an example of this, that just taking Saddam Hussein out, that, that led to most of the actual military resistance going away. What they didn't do, and what seems to be the case, is that they didn't pay quite as much attention to what happened after 2003 and the absolute, debacle and ongoing conflict that the U.S. was faced with in Iraq. And so that lesson from those who looked at the Chinese press reporting on this seems to be that, they just simply haven't gotten it, and they don't anticipate it, and they're looking for a knockout punch. But if the knockout punch doesn't come through and they get across and things happen, that, they're not necessarily mentally prepared for it. And so that's really sort of the challenge. And so, from a, calculus point of view, they may think, well, hey, resist, if we can just simply take out the top, civilian leadership, the rest will fall into place. So that's a little bit dangerous from the point of view of, maybe being a little bit more risk acceptant.
Yeah, so I would just add that to your prescriptions for your talk and your presentation. And because you're really interested, like, as am I, in deterring a conflict from happening in the first place. And I agree with all your prescriptions. You'll see it in our report for UCSD Asia Society tomorrow. We agree with your prescriptions about what Taiwan needs to do. But one of the things that Taiwan would then need to do is to actually convey those capabilities and that resolve so as to deter the mainland from using force in the first place under certain circumstances. Because if the mainland believes they will collapse, no matter how much actual fighting capacity they have, that won't be important for deterrence. It'll only be important for war fighting, and that would be a tragedy.
So in the interest of time, there's one last question from a Sarah Godek, who is a Master's of Public Policy student at U.S.-China Cooperation at the University of Michigan. She asks, what tactics and channels of dialogue are currently being utilized by the U.S. to avoid an incident that might lead to war? In the event of an incident with respect to Taiwan, what de-escalation tactics might the U.S. pursue to ensure that there is not an ensuing border conflict or broader conflict?
Okay, so I interpret this question to mean what communication channels are there with China and not with Taiwan. So if that's the case, I'll just talk kind of briefly about this. Yeah, so at present, the military relationship with China is in a very weak spot. A lot of those dialogues, regular interactions between senior leaders have either been suspended or canceled or not renewed. And so some of the muscle, if you will, for being able to communicate in peacetime, in crisis with the Chinese, I think has atrophied. That being said, there are certainly some discussions and ways of sending messages to the PLA or to China's civilian leadership. I think that probably could be utilized. And from China's point of view too, I think that they also have an appetite to a degree at least to be able to build back some of that muscle, at least so that things that aren't planned, so miscalculations, accidents, things that throw them off their timeline and that could potentially wind them up in a situation that they don't want to be in, can be avoided. I do see some appetite for that. And so I suspect over the next year or so in this administration that some of those channels will be used. If it's a question of an intentional Chinese plan to invade Taiwan, however, this would be the classic case to channel Kurt Campbell here, that the phones would ring out in the empty rooms, because why would they want to answer the phone if that's their plan? So I don't see some of those mechanisms as particularly relevant for deliberate military actions, and in fact they might be misused and be a source of misinformation and misleading information from the Chinese. So that's a couple of ways of thinking about this.
Okay, is that all of them, Daniel?
Yep, that's all of them.
Okay, well, that's perfect timing too. I mean, I don't think we've ever had such perfect timing for the Q&A period ending right on schedule. What a terrific start for our year, Joel. We knew it would be, and you did not disappoint. So thanks so much for an excellent presentation, a great Q&A period. And I think that it's just great to see so many people participating actively, and please do so in the future. Just remember to tell us who you are when you do. We appreciate knowing who you are and your affiliations. Thanks to everybody, and thanks again to Joel. Please feel free, Joel, to join us as an attendee for our future talks.
Will do. Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks, Joel. Really appreciate it. Bye, everybody.
Bye, Daniel.